Imagine getting your child ready for school one morning. Her bag is packed, her uniform is straightened, and you give her a quick goodbye before she's on her way. A day like any other. Now imagine, instead of picking her up that afternoon, you receive a call that she's missing. You see, there's a psychological contract that we all sign without even realizing it. We believe that schools are safe, that routine offers protection, and that danger looks obvious when it arrives. And overall, we believe that bad things happen somewhere else, to someone else, not us. On the 7th of August 2024, the illusion of safety collapsed in the small town of Caladon in the Western Cape. And over the weeks and months that followed, belief systems would be severely challenged. This is the story of a 16-year-old girl who went to school but would never come back home. This is Deveney Nel. Welcome back to Murder Mayhem, a Bella Monsoon exclusive production. I know we're full swing into 2026 already, but since this is my first video of the year, Happy New Year! Did you miss my face on here? I certainly did miss all of yours. Well, your names and your comments, because I don't really get the chance to see your faces. But know that even if I don't see your faces, I am so appreciative of each and every single one of you, and thankful that I get to spread the stories that I do and keep memories alive. So for those of you who are new, let me introduce myself, but if you are returning, no need to stick around to hear me ramble. You can skip ahead using the timestamp on screen. So here it is in a nutshell. I'm a mental health professional who just so happens to be obsessed with psychology, true crime, and understanding the motives that drive people to do what they do. My knowledge and experience within the field thus led me to create the first trauma-informed South African true crime series. That means that within the series, I post documentary-styled episodes that look at real-life crimes from a psychological viewpoint. During these episodes, I also try to share psychological knowledge and concepts that you may or may not be aware of in an easy-to-understand format. If all of that sounds like something that is right up your proverbial alley, then please do consider subscribing and joining the Bellaboo fam. But if you're more a fan of podcasts and not so much of watching my face, no worries, I got you and I will not hold it against you. You can find me for my sister podcast, Murder Mayhem, South African True Crime, available to stream on all major streaming channels. So I covered this case from the moment Deveney went missing to the moment the accused was sentenced, but so many of the sheer horrific details were not allowed on the platforms that I covered them on, and so here we are. So as always, please heed the disclaimer. Today's narrative contains material citing the murder and assault of a minor. As always, I mean absolutely no disrespect to the victim nor her family. The purpose of this video is to shed further light on the heinous crime that was committed while spreading awareness about the psychological nature of the narrative. This episode has been thoroughly researched by myself and includes publicly accessible real-life accounts, footage, and images of and from individuals involved directly in the case. So without further delay, let's get into it. Before Deveney Nel became a headline, she was just a child living an ordinary teen life. At the point of her narrative where we meet her, she's 16 years old and a grade 10 learner at the Overberg High School in Caladon. So for those of you not from South Africa or just unfamiliar with the area, Caladon is a small Overberg town with a population of roughly 13,000 people. It's a kind of small town where routines are predictable and strangers are easily noticed. It is known for its hot springs, surrounding farmland, and its role as an administrative hub. But more than anything, it is known for being quiet. In towns like these, crime does not just fade into background noise. When something goes wrong, it ripples through the entire community. Every unanswered question feels heavier. Because in a place where everyone knows everyone, nothing is supposed to go unnoticed. So with that understanding, back to Deveney. Those who knew her described her as quiet, soft-spoken, gentle. She was hardly the loudest voice in the room and not someone who sought attention. But she was a girl with a kind heart, going out of her way to help others, even working as a volunteer at the first aid tent during school events. She was known as a girl who showed up, took part in activities, and lived within the rhythm of a small town where routines feel safe. Even before the moments that would tragically end her existence, Deveney's life had been shaped by loss. In 2022, her father had left this earth. And then, just 3 months before she would be murdered, her grandfather also died. Each loss leading to compounded familial grief. Deveney's mother, Lida, worked in administration at a nearby fruit farm, staying strong throughout everything for her 2 daughters, Deveney and her younger sister. Even before Deveney's passing, she was a woman who had carried more grief than most. So that was Deveney and her family. Because when I talk about victims, it's easy to just focus on how they died. But what matters just as much is how they lived. So at this point, our narrative takes us to the 5th of August, 2024, 2 days before Deveney would leave this earth. At school, there had apparently been a fight between herself and another girl. A fight over a boy. But after the fight was over, not much more was said about it, and life appeared to go on as per normal. Until that is, we arrive at Wednesday, the 7th of August, 2024, 2 days later. It was a sports day at Caladon High School, and their rugby and netball teams were therefore playing against a different school, Bredasdorp High School. Now, whilst Deveney wasn't actually playing sports that day, she was, however, on first aid duty. So remember that and keep it in mind because the little details are so important within this case. Witnesses would later state that Deveney was in a good mood. She was happy being surrounded by her peers. But as the afternoon drew to a close, games finished, kids got on buses and went back home, Deveney had missed her lift club. It was 6 p.m. and although those who were part of that lift club had tried to contact her via her cell phone multiple times, all attempts were futile. And so her mother was called, a call that she would never forget. And after a quick search of the surrounding school area, Deveney was reported missing. In a matter of hours, her face would be posted across multiple social media channels, broadcast in WhatsApp conversations, and of course a formal case was logged at the police station. This case thus led to a police search at the last place that she had been seen, her school. And there, in a locked room near the school hall on school premises, her lifeless body would be discovered, with stab wounds to her neck and upper body. However, from preliminary investigations, it was evident to those on scene that the storage room was not the primary crime scene. Evidence existed in the form of bloodied drag marks that led to the bathroom and change rooms. Upon the harrowing discovery, a murder docket was officially opened, and the case was passed to the Serious and Violent Crimes team. The school was also closed on the following day, the 8th of August, and counseling services were made available to both students, teachers, as well as parents. And as you can imagine, as the news broke about the shocking discovery, so many questions were being raised, especially surrounding the space in which the crime had occurred. Questions about the safety of the pupils, about why some cameras in the school just weren't working, and ultimately about how such a horrific thing could have occurred in a place of safety. And what compounded these conversations was the fact that there was not yet an immediate arrest or clear indication of who had done this. I mean, parents were terrified, as you can imagine, to send their children back to school, and the children were equally as terrified. I mean, during this time period, I had so many from the school reach out to me personally. So as Lida, Deveney's mother, battled to come to terms with her new reality, security at the school was tightened, given the conversations that were occurring both online and offline. Although the circumstances were being investigated, like any investigation, the police were unable to divulge information to the public that could jeopardize the integrity of the case and potential arrests. As I mentioned, I was in contact with many very close to the case over the days that followed, and thus I received quite a bit of information. but ethically and legally, I chose not to divulge any of it. Instead, I requested that any tangible leads be sent directly to the investigating officers in the case. The thing is though, because not much was being said publicly whilst the case progressed, this led many parents and community alike to believe that perhaps not much was being done by the police force. And I get it, the silence is difficult to process, especially if you are part of the community or you have a child in the community. Fortunately though, the community wouldn't have to wait long for progress to be made. Just over a week after her murder, the day after a school memorial service was held, which many of her school peers attended, an arrest was made. An arrest that would shock those who were not part of the small community. Heck, even some of those who were in the small community. Because it was an arrest that not many saw coming. Because you see, on Friday the 16th of August 2024, a 17-year-old male was arrested for the murder of Deveney Nel. At the time of the arrest, no further information was shared, and due to the age of the accused, his identity was legally withheld as per the Child Justice Act. The following Monday, he would appear in the Caladon Magistrates Court. As expected, media were barred from entering the space, and the suspect's identity was obviously not shared. Protesters were out in force outside the courthouse voicing their concerns. The session, however, was brief, and the suspect, who was then believed to be a student at the very same school, was moved to a safe space. Speaking to the media, several students spoke about how the suspect appeared to be a normal teenager who enjoyed joking around, hockey, and was an A student. And as many tried to come to terms with the new developments, the case was postponed for a month to allow for further investigation. But although the case had taken a short break, the conversations doing the rounds online had not. It became very apparent very quickly that many were well aware of who this young man was. And as the days turned into weeks, which eventually turned into months, a disturbing pattern of behaviour would be divulged and come to light. But I'll be getting into that shortly. So at the next court appearance, there was another postponement to allow for cell phone and computer analysis to be conducted. It was also heard that despite the horrific actions and the case being levied against him, he would most likely be tried as a minor. This despite his history of previously accused offences. Yes, as in multiple. So doing that math around the case just angered the community even more. Because now you not only had an individual who was being charged as a minor, he was a few months away from turning 18, but you also had an individual with a history of disturbing behavior. An individual who, due to the Child Justice Act, could have the potential for more lenient punishment despite the cruelty of the act he was accused of. So as you can imagine, it was a pot just waiting to bubble over. So if you know my content, you'll know that I usually wait until the end of episodes to speak about the perpetrator. But in order for you, the individual on the other side of this narrative, to truly understand this case in its entirety, I need to get it all out into the open. So I want to introduce the accused in this case. Of course, not his real name, but a name that many have taken to calling him. So let's call him Frank. So 17-year-old Frank was from a well-off family who lived in Caladon, but he had not always lived there. So as I mentioned, he was no stranger to violent behavior, this stemming from early childhood. I'm talking about little grade 3 Frank, who managed to get into a physical altercation with a teacher who had intervened after he had pushed a girl over a desk. And then in a separate incident, he had attacked a fellow student with a pen. In grade 5, he was apparently bullied and he had also been in detention multiple times for fighting. Then, after being seen by a psychologist, he was transferred over to Overberg Primary School. In grade 7, just a couple years later after his first known offense, he had then punched another student. And if you're a true crime fundi or just have some knowledge in the area, you will know that these types of behaviors often escalate. From pushing and shoving students to a shocking alleged assault on an 11-year-old girl just months later, Frank's pattern of devolving behavior was more than evident. And so for a moment, I want to tell you a story within a story. The story of Annie. That's not her real name, but she was a girl whose path would unfortunately cross with Frank just years ago. You see, it was back in December of 2020 at a private camping ground outside Albertina in the Western Cape. Annie's mother was in the midst of a divorce, and so wanting to do something nice for her daughter during this difficult time, she had taken her to a local camping ground for them to spend New Year's. Concurrently, 13-year-old Frank had just finished grade 7 at his new school, Overberg Primary School, and so he had gone with his parents to the very same camping ground to spend the holiday season. And because it was still kind of in the midst of the pandemic, just a few months after everything had started, they were the only 2 families at the ground during this time period. Remember small details like this for later. At the camping ground, the kids, being the only children there, would end up befriending one another. On the day they met, they played ball, they rowed a canoe, and they hung out. It was, however, the next day, a sunny New Year's Day, when horror unfolded. The pair had spent time together on the day, taking a walk out to the grounds, but after the boy had returned back, Frank, Annie was nowhere to be seen. So here's what had happened. Annie had taken her sketchbook out to a hill overlooking the lake with the idea to sketch the picturesque landscape. Frank, her new friend, had offered to come with her. On the way there, he had made a sexual joke. Not something that she had really paid attention to at the time because, she was 11 years old. Moments later, he had grabbed Annie from behind, strangling her, and later throwing her sketchbook into the body of water. After he was done assaulting her, he had then left her and he had returned back to his campsite. Her mother, not having her daughter come back, began to frantically search for her child. A short while later, she would find her daughter, bruised and unconscious in the reeds of a nearby river. The traumatized girl would later explain to her mother how she had been assaulted and raped by this boy, Frank, and essentially left for dead. Of course, the police were called to the camping ground, and later the camping ground owner would also confirm that these 2 families were the only families in the area on the day. After the horrific incident occurred, the mother of the girl would later say that she felt let down by the state after she was left to deal with the emotional and physical aftermath of the attack on her daughter all by herself. This was even after her daughter at 11 years old had been brave enough to choose to testify against her accused perpetrator. And it would be after his arrest for Deveney's murder in 2024 that this young girl, Annie, would speak out once again, sharing her desire for justice to be served for Deveney. Because you see, 3 days after the allegations had been levied against him back in 2020, Frank had been interviewed by a probation officer. During their conversation, Frank showed zero emotion, appeared confident and well-spoken. Keep in mind, he was 13 years old at the time. Frank also denied any of the accusations against him, stating that he had done nothing wrong. At the time, he was living with his family in Grabo, just a neighboring town, and although he did not have many friends, he was described as a generally happy child. In May of 2022, he would be seen by yet more psychologists, where in the report compiled, it was seen how he not only found it difficult to express his emotions, but also showcased very little empathy. The records would also later show that he had apparently lost an important male role model when he was 9 years old and struggled with potentially hereditary mental health problems. During that evaluation, he had told psychologists at the time, and I quote, "I follow my own rules. I don't like being controlled. I like causing trouble." He would go on to describe himself as a decision maker with a short fuse, stating that he would not hesitate to use violence in order to get his point across. So with all of this information, all of these warning signs, all of these cries for help, something had to come of it, right? Well, here's the kicker. Nothing did. You see, the report from July 7th, 2022 that was compiled would state that Frank's behavior was immature. His psychological development was compromised by his cognitive weaknesses and persistent difficulty concentrating. And thus, the psychiatrists and psychologists at Valkenburg Psychiatric Hospital found him not criminally responsible for his behavior. They did, however, state that there was a high risk that he would reoffend and that he would use physical violence. The official recommendation, therefore, was that he be sent to the Children's Court for further investigation, as well as the possibility of entrance into a psychoeducational program. because Frank also demonstrated inappropriate sexual behavior, and thus it was supposed to be determined whether psychological intervention would be needed to assist in this regard. A letter was apparently sent from the state prosecutor in this case to the Department of Social Development in Grabouw requesting that Frank be placed in a program for sex offenders. However, the department would later deny ever receiving such a letter. The state would thus make the decision to withdraw the case on the 4th of August 2022, due to the fact that the boy was allegedly found to not be criminally responsible for his actions. A magistrate who would later begin receiving death threats after all of this came to light would be seen to have failed in her duty to act and ensure that the boy was placed in an appropriate program. But back in 2023, however, the Department of Public Prosecutions would withdraw the case. And in the same breath and pattern of denial, Overberg High School, as well as the Department of Education, would deny any knowledge of the rape accusations. Essentially, the entire case. And the psychiatrist and the psychologist recommendations would end up shoved in a file in a drawer somewhere. And throughout all of this, Frank's very own family, along potentially with other institutions and organizations, aware of the behavior that this child had been exhibiting, did absolutely nothing. If you're a regular here, you will know that I'm always saying, if you see something, say something, do something. Because more often than not, these types of behaviors don't just pop up out of the blue. Behavioral warning signs are often overlooked or ignored, and especially within children, there needs to be more stringent practices at play for both parents of minors with problematic behaviors, as well as the state in ensuring better measures are taken. Because if they're not, there are often a string of victims that are left in the wake of these individuals. One being Annie, the girl who was allegedly left for dead by Frank at the camping grounds back in 2020. A young girl who would never receive the justice that she deserved, but yet was still determined to fight for justice for Deveney Nel. A young girl who is haunted by her survivor's guilt, questioning to herself why Frank didn't end her life the same way he did Deveney's. And this level of inaction prevailing, it leads us back to 2024, when yet another young girl would enter Frank's trajectory, but this time she would not escape with her life. This time she would pay the price for the inaction of institutions and individuals that came before her. You see, Frank had actually known Deveney for years. They were far from strangers, actually quite the opposite. They were both in the same primary school together, remember Overberg Primary School where Frank was moved to, and they had grown close over the years, and in later years they had dated on and off, but nothing serious. I mean, they were still young. It is, however, believed that jealousy around other relationships in this particular case was the motive for the murder. After the news of Deveney's murder and Frank's subsequent arrest broke, many girls would end up coming forward stating that Frank had allegedly blackmailed them with private images that they had sent to him. He had apparently sent these girls images of, well, himself, and allegedly encouraged them to return the favor. After the exchange, however, he would then use these images to blackmail them into performing physical favors for him and threatened to send these images to everyone they knew if they did not comply. According to the online article I read in that regard, several of the girls had given statements to the police, but at the time they had chosen to not press charges. And before anyone asks why, because I know there will be someone who will be questioning this, ultimately in this world, in our society currently, even if you are the victim in such a situation, somehow the blame and the shame will always land on you, regardless of the fact that you were a victim of exploitation. And hopefully that is something that is going to change in the years to come. That is already changing. I see it on social media. Because I, for one, am absolutely sick and tired of perpetrators having less stigma and shame attached to them than victims. But back to Frank and Deveney and the day that she would have her life stolen. The day had started like any other day, but with one key difference, because that afternoon, an inter-school sports day was being held. On the day, both Deveney and Frank were two of the students who had volunteered to man the first aid stations. As the day progressed, as I earlier mentioned, Deveney appeared to be in good spirits, laughing, joking, and hanging out with her peers. Initially, it was unknown how exactly Deveney had ended up with Frank in the storage rooms, but what was known is that it was there that her body with several stab wounds to her chest and neck was discovered. It would later be divulged in the weeks that followed that Deveney had sustained 2 of the stab wounds to the main arteries in her neck and 1 to her heart, indicative of the fact that her perpetrator, Frank, knew exactly where to aim and focus his attacks in order to take her life. A theory that he himself would later horrifically confirm to the court. After Frank had fatally wounded her and she lay bleeding out, he would leave her body in the storage room. He would then take her scrunchie, her blue hair tie, as well as her cell phone and dump it in the back of a teacher's parked bakkie. For those who are not from South Africa, a bakkie is basically a pickup truck. He would even later call her cell phone, which by this time had been found by the aforementioned teacher, and tell them that Deveney's carpool club members were looking for her. He also went on to join the search party whilst well aware of the brutal crime that he had just committed. When her body was initially discovered, it was heard how Frank, in the company of a policeman at the time, had vehemently tried to gain access to the storage room, stating that he had first aid experience and that he could help her. In the days to come, Frank would go on to attend the school's memorial service for Deveney along with many other students, all whilst very unaware that investigators were watching his every move. And the proverbial net was closing in. You see, investigators had interviewed over 10 individuals closest to Deveney, and through this they had discovered 4 teenage boys whom they believed could have something to do with her murder. One of the 4, Frank, not only happened to be on first aid duty with her on the day, but also happened to have had a previous relationship with her. So yeah, you could say ding ding ding, the money was on him. Although the CCTV cameras near the storage room where Deveney was found were not working, other footage from cameras on the school grounds, as well as a video camera set up to record the rugby, proved vitally essential in building this case. Using the footage as well as eyewitness accounts, the team were able to deduce that Deveney was last seen near the netball courts just after 4 p.m. Frank was then seen leaving the field around 4:05, just after the first teams ran onto the field to begin their play. At around 4:23, 18 minutes later, he is then seen returning back to the field. Deveney, however, would never be seen alive again. So here's exactly what happened in those 18 minutes, which would later be divulged months later. Frank and Deveney had allegedly agreed to meet in the changing rooms that day. They then, according to him of course, ended up sharing consensual intimate moments. But afterwards, Frank would allege that Deveney had told him that she had a boyfriend. A boyfriend that he had no knowledge of. And so, according to Frank, once again, because remember, Frank's account is the only account we have. So he alleges that at this point, he lost his temper, he began to strangle her, and then he took out a knife that he had in his jacket pocket. At this point, he began stabbing her, aiming for her main arteries. She had fought back, fought for her life, but due to the force of the attack, her left lung had collapsed. The blade had then pierced the right ventricle of her heart. Her body was left bruised, full of abrasions and cuts, all Frank's doing. As she bled out, he then dragged her to the back of the storeroom where he hid her body before leaving. Fellow students would report seeing Frank in the buildings on 3 occasions, but without the first aid vest he had previously been wearing. I assume this is due to the fact that it had Deveney's blood all over it. Regardless, his DNA would be found on her body, her clothing, and the crime scene. But I digress. Using the available footage, his movements were then tracked on the exact route he had taken, where he had dumped the cell phone and hair tie into Jacques Force's bakkie, the teacher. And so, keeping all of this in mind, by Wednesday the 14th of August, detectives were certain that they had their man, or their boy, or their teenager, I guess. During the memorial service, one of the investigative team were assigned to observe his every movement and take videos if anything seemed out of the ordinary. And this is exactly what they did, as he, along with other students, wrote Deveney a goodbye letter and shared their memories of the life that had been stolen so prematurely. And then, shortly after midnight, the investigative team would arrest Frank at his family home, where his parents, as well as his lawyer, were waiting. Yeah, they were prepared. For 9 hours, he would be questioned, obviously in the presence of an adult, a family member, because he was a minor at the time. And for 8 of those hours, he would stick to his story that he had absolutely nothing to do with Deveney's murder. However, in the 9th hour, he would finally crack. The man interviewing him, renowned warrant officer Johan Buxton Lowe, would later recall that Frank's mother, who was present during the interview, had told him that he should speak. Frank had said, "I did it." Johan had asked, "What did you do?" Frank had replied, "No, but she's dead." Johan had once again asked, "What did you do?" Frank had said, "No, but I'm the guy." And Johan had responded, "You're the guy, what?" To which Frank had said, "I killed her." This would lead to him handing over evidence and divulging further information that would put him at the scene. Some of the information which I've shared with you just previously. And so, he was locked up. As the law requires, the next day he would make a confession before an external officer. According to the police officers who were present, his nonchalant recount of the actions of that day shocked even the most hardened of them. Because remember, this is still a 17-year-old child admitting to committing the most heinous act. And so he was arrested. And so our narrative now returns back where we left off a few minutes ago. Outside the court, protesters gathered at each court appearance, with a local anti-GBV organization, 1 Billion Rising, creating a petition to appeal that the arrested boy not be released on bail. At the time of it being handed over, it had around 1,400 signatures. But wait, in the midst of all of that, the mother of the arrested and accused teenager, Frank, obtained a protection order against 2 of the activists in what appeared to be an attempt to silence their protests seeking justice for Deveney Nel. But I mean, if you can even believe it, Frank's family were not done there. Additionally, his mother then went after a renowned local journalist and author, Julian Janssen, with a gag order to prevent him from publishing any articles, manuscripts, or books that referred to her son or her family, her husband and her 2 sons, one being the murder accused, whether it be in the printed media or on social media. And look, I can't say that that worked very well because Julian ended up publishing an entire book on the case before the sentencing was even concluded. You see, allegedly, he had tried to contact the family multiple times for interviews and to let them know that he was writing a book on the case, and that's where they were tipped off, cheesed off, unhappy at the fact that a version of the events that they could not control was going to be shared publicly. I mean, I'm just assuming that that was the issue. And so, as the case went on, there were a few delays, court proceedings continued, and the accused ended up turning 18 in April of 2025. But of course, because the Criminal Procedures Act in South Africa was amended in 2021, despite becoming an adult legally, the media is still prohibited from identifying suspected minor offenders. The now adult accused was then transferred from his place of safety, which was the Outeniqua Children and Youth Center in George, to Pollsmoor Prison to await his next court appearance. In Pollsmoor, he would be held in the juvenile pre-trial ward. So yeah, whilst the court case of an alleged murderer was taking place and being moved to the High Court in Cape Town, there were also other court proceedings taking place to try and silence those who were speaking out against the accused and those who were fighting ultimately for justice for Deveney Nel, the victim. Yeah, I mean, honestly, just when I thought that I had seen it all. And in case I didn't mention it, Frank was facing a charge of murder, defeating the ends of justice, as well as rape. After his arrest and initial court appearance, in a very unsurprising turn of events, a request was made for him to have an evaluation at Valkenburg Psychiatric Hospital. By this point, he was quite familiar with the institution. After a bed at Falkenberg Psychiatric Hospital became available, 30 days later, after visiting the same place he had just a few years prior, he would be deemed fit to stand trial. Following that, in mid-September of 2025, Frank was due to appear at his preliminary hearing. The entire trial would not take place though, because it was heard in October of 2025 that Frank had signed a plea deal and a sentence agreement. Within his confession, he had stated how he assaulted and stabbed Deveney to death before hiding her body to cover up the murder. He would end up pleading guilty to 1 count of murder as well as 1 count of defeating the ends of justice. Although he had been previously also charged with rape, that charge for some reason was withdrawn. He would ultimately be sentenced to 25 years in prison for murder and 12 months for obstruction of justice. The sentences are set to run concurrently. This particular ruling was spoken about widely after it had been handed down, as it was one of the longest terms that had been handed to a minor, and was thought that it would serve as an important example and case in the legal sphere for years to come. And yes, even though he is an adult, he is a convicted criminal, his name is still not allowed to be divulged as per the Children's Act. By the time a case has reached sentencing, there's often the sense that, at least publicly that is, the case has reached its conclusion. The legal system has spoken, a number has been attached to the harm that has been done, and collective attention begins to slowly drift elsewhere. But psychologically, that is rarely where a story like this actually ends. Because once the facts are known and an outcome has been decided, what remains is a far more uncomfortable question. One that cannot be answered simply by a court ruling or a prison sentence. And get ready for it, because this is the long question. How does a 17-year-old boy with a documented history of violence move through multiple systems over a number of years without meaningful intervention, without sustained accountability, and without anyone, not one single person, successfully interrupting the trajectory that led to this disturbing crime? From a psychological standpoint, extreme violence is rarely the beginning of any story. It's the endpoint of a process that unfolds slowly, often quietly, and in ways that are easy to minimize when viewed in isolation. What we see repeatedly in cases involving serious youth violence is not a single moment where everything suddenly goes wrong, but rather a pattern of escalation. Early acts of aggression that are reframed as behavioral issues. Boundary violations that are treated as immaturity, harm that is contextualized, excused or explained away because confronting it directly feels uncomfortable, complicated, or disproportionate at the time. And each instance where this violence goes unchallenged sends a message, even if it's unintentional. It teaches that harm is survivable, consequences are negotiable, and that authority can be resisted without a lasting impact. And over time, those lessons are not simply learned, they are internalized, and they begin to shape identity rather than behavior alone. There is a deeply rooted belief in many societies that boys in particular will grow out of aggression, that anger is a phase, and that time will correct what an intervention may have otherwise exposed. Psychology, however, does not support that belief. In fact, research consistently shows that patterns of violent or coercive behavior that are left unaddressed in childhood and adolescence are far more likely to intensify rather than resolve on their own. But don't get me wrong, this is not about labeling children as irredeemable or writing them off at an early age. It's about recognizing risk when it presents itself. And most importantly, responding in ways that prioritize safety, accountability, and genuine behavioral change. Discomfort with naming these harmful behaviors do not neutralize their behaviors. They simply just delay their consequences. Any meaningful analysis of this case requires us to look honestly at how masculinity is socialized, particularly within environments where dominance, control, and emotional suppression are implicitly rewarded. I'm pretty sure many will agree with me that boys are often taught, explicitly or otherwise, that anger is strength and vulnerability is weakness. unworthiness, and that rejection or humiliation must be responded to instead of being processed. I know that many of the parenting models currently being circulated are taking massive steps to kind of right these wrongs per se, but it is a process. I mean, I for one still see way too many of those loud and proud boy moms. And before any of you come for me, it has absolutely nothing to do with being the mother of sons. If you know what I mean, you know what I mean. So within the framework that I mentioned, emotional distress doesn't just disappear. It is displaced. So instead of being processed and dealt with, it turns into entitlement. It turns into resentment. It turns into a perceived need to reassert control over a situation. And this is exactly what is meant when we, individuals in general, speak about toxic masculinity. It's not an attack on masculinity itself, but it's simply a critique of cultural scripts and behaviors that are currently being seen. You know, the ones that discourage empathy, accountability, emotional regulation, whilst at the same time normalizing aggression as a legitimate response to a perceived threat or a loss of status. Yeah, those ones. And so then when these cultural messages intersect with a history of unchecked violence, the risk does not just remain static. No, it compounds. And then, without even taking into consideration society and the individual, we can look at the systemic failures that are particularly apt and very prevalent within South Africa. So look at it this way. Different institutions encounter different versions of the same individual. So in essence, they hold only a piece of the puzzle. For example, schools will see behavioral challenges. The justice system will see isolated incidents that make it to their radar. And social services, well, they may not see anything at all. And so when these systems do not communicate effectively, patterns that ultimately would have been seen get lost in paperwork. Warning signs become administrative footnotes. And responsibility is quietly transferred to the next person instead of being collectively held. Violence in these circumstances is not prevented. It is simply managed, it is deferred, and it is passed along until the cost of that avoidance is borne by an innocent individual most of the time. And yes, I know these conversations are not the most fun to have, but this is why they are important, even if they are uncomfortable. And understanding and speaking about the forces at play is not about excusing harm, it's not about reducing accountability, but it's about prevention. It's literally why I incorporate these segments into every single episode that I do. Prevention is not possible until we stop treating violence like something that just, bam, happens right out of the blue, and start acknowledging that warning signs may have been present in weeks, months, years prior, but they were just uncomfortable or inconvenient to acknowledge. And yet for all the analysis and explanations and frameworks and understandings that I can share, there's one reality that it doesn't change. None of this brings Deveney back. Psychology can help us make sense of behavior, patterns, and systems, but it cannot undo a loss. It cannot restore futures that were stolen, or try and fill the space in a family that now have to navigate such a deafening emptiness. For Deveney's family, life did not pause at sentencing, and it did not reset with the verdict. It simply continued, altered in ways that are permanent and deeply personal. Her mother now carries the daily weight of a daughter who should still be here, while her younger sister grows up in a world where milestones are marked by memory rather than shared experience. This is the part of the story that cannot be intellectualized away, because behind every single psychological explanation is a family living with the quiet, ongoing reality of loss. Leader Deveney's mother spoke out in her victim impact statement about how she was light years away from forgiving the monster who not only stole her daughter's life, but made her suffer so significantly. She would say, And I translate and quote, "To give up or lose your daughter or child to another's hand is the most painful pain that can exist in a parent's life. The pain is unimaginable. I will never be able to fully describe or express it." End quote. In the moments that surrounded the sentencing, Deveney's mother spoke not as a legal participant in the case, but as a mother, trying to anchor her daughter's memory in truth and not tragedy. She reminded those who knew Deveney, as well as those who had never met her but had stood up and fought for justice for her, who her daughter was. Deveney was a girl full of compassion, someone who consistently put other people's feelings before her own, often without drawing attention to herself or expecting anything in return. She had a strong sense of right and wrong, and she was not afraid to stand up for what she believed was fair, even when doing so was uncomfortable. She wanted to pursue a career one day that would allow her to continue helping others, to give back in ways that reflected the empathy she carried so naturally. She had an entire life ahead of her, and that life was cut short. For her younger sister Jamie, the loss was not only that of a sibling, but of a best friend, the person who was meant to grow old alongside her, to share memories no one else would fully understand, to laugh about childhood moments years later, and to carry the private language that only sisters develop over time. That bond was broken, and in its place is a void that no one and nothing else can fill. What was taken that day was not only Deveney's future, but also the futures that she was woven into. She was denied a graduation, denied a matric dance, denied the chance to grow up slowly and fully, to build a life, have a career, have a child, find love, or have a family. These are not just abstract losses, but they are concrete moments that will never arrive. The prosecutor in this case would later describe the motive behind the murder as being rooted in toxic masculinity, a jealous rage driven by entitlement and control. But beyond the legal framing lies a deeper truth. What happened to Deveney was the result of a chain of behaviors and failures that ultimately led to one irreversible moment. Deveney was not a lesson. She was not a warning sign. She was a person. Remembering her means refusing to let her be solely defined by how her life ended, and instead honoring who she was, what she lived for, and the future she should have been allowed to have. I mean, if there's anything that this case demands of us, it's an ability to look harder at the systems that we rely on, the behaviors that we excuse, and the silences that we maintain. Because silence, minimization, and inaction are not neutral. They shape outcomes. Annie deserved better. Deveney deserved better. Their families deserved better. Thank you for watching, for caring, and for honoring Deveney by listening. Until we meet again, stay safe, stay blessed, and stay the amazing human beings that I know each and every single one of you are. Bye!